Hey folks, Pastor Brian again, and we are taking a look at Ephesians chapter 2. Today we're starting the second half of that chapter, and it's moving into a new thought block, a new section of the chapter, starting in verse 11 all the way through verse 22. Today I just want to introduce that section with verses 11 and 12. So this is Ephesians 2, 11 and 12. Therefore, remember that formerly you, the Gentiles in the flesh, who are called uncircumcision by the so-called circumcision, which is performed in the flesh by human hands, remember that you were at that time separate from Christ, excluded from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers to the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. Now, in this section, the Apostle Paul is starting to describe the condition of the Gentiles before they came to faith in Jesus Christ. I would just call this the past wretchedness of the Gentiles. They're called uncircumcision here. And when Jews use the term uncircumcision, they used it sort of as an ethnic slur. You might see people today using terms like nigger or wetback or gringo as ethnic slurs. Well, that was similar to what was happening when the Jews would call Gentiles uncircumcision. Remember in 1 Samuel 17:26, when Goliath was fighting against David, and David said to him, "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should taunt the armies of the living God?" He was insulting Goliath by using the term uncircumcised. Now, we're also told that if a Jew were to marry a Gentile woman, his family would hold a funeral service for him. We know that some Jewish women refused to help a Gentile woman give birth because in so doing, they would be bringing another Gentile into the world, which is unthinkable for many Jews. When a Jew would exit Gentile lands and come back into the Jewish Holy Land, he would shake the dust off of his sandals so that he wouldn't contaminate that holy land that he was entering. And this hostility was centuries old. It had a very long history. Now, what do we know about these Gentiles before they came to Jesus Christ? Well, Paul tells us several things here. Number one, they were without Christ. That was different from the Jewish people because they did have a Christ, a Messiah that was sent to her. But these Gentiles had no promise of a Messiah. They had no vital union to Jesus Christ. According to 1 John 5:12, it says, "He who does not have the Son of God does not have life." They did not have the Son of God. They did not have Jesus, the Christ, the Messiah. So they had no eternal life at all. Second thing we're told about them is that they were without the commonwealth of Israel. Commonwealth, the riches, the spiritual riches that were given to the Jews were not given to the Gentiles. And we read about those spiritual riches in Romans 9, verses 4 and 5. They had such things as the Old Testament scriptures. The oracles of God had been entrusted to them. They also had the promises of God. They had the prophecies given through the prophets to the people of Israel. They had the law. The giving of the law was given to the Jews. They had the priesthood and the sacrifice, the whole sacrificial system. They had the glorious presence of Jehovah God, the true and living God who walked with his people. And they had the promise of the Messiah who was to come in order to save his people from their sins. The Gentiles were entirely excluded from all of this. Number three, they were without the covenants. Now, God had made several covenants to his people throughout history. He made a covenant with Abraham. When he made that covenant with Abraham, he promised them a land, and he promised them a descendant who would bring blessing to all the nations of the world. God made a covenant with David, and in that covenant, he promised David that he would give him a descendant to sit upon his throne. God made a covenant through Moses to the Jewish people. And in that covenant, he promised physical blessings to Israel as long as Israel obeyed God and kept his covenant. But the Gentiles had no certified promises from God to bless them, to prosper them, and to save them, just like the Jews had. Number four, they were without hope. The Gentiles were without hope. Because they had no knowledge of the true and living God, the Gentiles had no hope for their future. Now, hope is based on a promise. It arises out of confidence in someone who can perform what they promise. But the Gentiles had no promises from the living God. When a Gentile died, he believed that he just ceased to exist, number one, or that his spirit was released to wander aimlessly in the netherworld throughout eternity. That's what they saw in their future when they died. The Jews had a much greater hope. They knew that they could be with God forever. And number 5, these Gentiles were without God. That's what Paul says there. And because they were without Christ, they were also without God. Remember that Jesus taught in John 14:6 that no man comes to the Father except through him, through Jesus Christ. Now, the Gentiles believed in many gods. They weren't atheists. They were polytheists. But they had no saving relationship with the true and the living God, the Creator God. And so they were without the true and living God. So what does this mean for us? Well, brothers and sisters, my guess is that you're a Gentile just like I am. Probably very few people with Jewish blood are watching this video. We're Gentiles. We have the same situation in our former past that these Gentiles did. Paul mentions the word formerly twice, verse 11 and verse 13. He's describing what formerly was the condition of these Gentiles before they came into a saving relationship with Jesus Christ. And that's exactly our same condition before we came to Christ as well. Our state was hopeless, but all of that was formerly. It's not true of us now that we have come to know Jesus Christ and have a relationship with the true and living God. And we'll save all of that for our next video. Hope you'll join me. God bless.